Welcome everyone to the University of Idaho, University of Wyoming Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series. We're pretty excited about today's host. But I should introduce our co-hosts, Melinda and Dr. Ellison and Ms. Carmen. They are our Idaho hosts who do a lot of the legwork. I'm your sporadic once a month co-host as well. So I'm glad to be on again, and I'm glad to present a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Richard Earhart from Michigan State University. Comes to us with a wealth of experience in both endocrine and reproductive expertise, especially in accelerated lambing and nutritional management during pregnancy, especially with prolific accelerated sheep production systems. So I won't give away a whole lot of his background and expertise. I'm hoping he'll tell us a little bit about his appointment at Michigan State and what he does. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Earhart. And again, thank you, Richard, for being on today.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for Melinda and Whit for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to some new folks, perhaps. Today, I thought I'd talk about the interaction, I guess I'd call it, between nutrition and reproduction. I mean, there's a lot of interaction between nutrition and reproduction in sheep production systems. And this has always been an interest of mine. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of areas today because I don't want to get too broad on the topic and maybe get a little more specific on a few things. It really is an untapped opportunity in sheep production, and an advantage that sheep have over other ruminant animals in terms of production efficiency, without a doubt. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-breeding nutrition and reproductive outcomes. I've pursued a couple of projects in this area over the last few years and going to kind of give you a sense of some of the things I've learned there. And then I thought I'd spend a little time also talking about Ulam development programs, because that's also an important interaction, you know, with nutritional management and getting sheep more lifetime productivity out of a sheep, for example. So as you probably are all aware, sheep can be very efficient ruminants for meat production. They certainly have a higher reproductive efficiency than cattle. In some sheep systems, some of the ones I work with, ewes can produce close to twice their weight in lambs per year. That's pretty phenomenal when you think about it. And that's mostly in systems that work with what we call prolific sheep that have twins or greater, and maybe even lamb more than once per year. So we have accelerated production systems, which Whit alluded to, that we work with. In some areas, they work really well. And they'll typically lamb every 8 months. So that could be around 1.5 lambs per ewe per year, just a little bit less. But, you know, when you think about it, the national lambing average really is hovering around 1 lamb per ewe per year. So we're not very close to that as a nation. And there's reasons for that, good and bad, I guess. But when you consider that, it's obvious that there's a great opportunity for improvement through genetics, certainly, and aspects of management. And this could include reproduction by itself, nutrition by itself, and kind of their interaction, which is what we're talking about today. So if we were to consider as just a broad overview of the nutritional management of reproductive ewes of breeding age, we'd be thinking about different chapters, if you will, of management. An important one that I'm going to talk about today is pre-breeding nutrition, which has a big impact on ovulation rate. Another important thing that I think we might know a little less about, actually, is what happens in early pregnancy in terms of embryo survival, or even just the ability of that embryo, the embryo to implant and then, you know, form a functional placenta. And then mid-pregnancy is important in the sense that it's a period when this would be sort of 50 days of pregnancy to maybe 100. It's that middle chapter. It's not as important nutritionally, perhaps, but just biologically, it's important in that the sheep grows, the ewe establishes this placenta, and the fetal maternal placenta grows like gangbusters during this period and really stops growing about in the middle of it. That's an important biological phenomena. But then in late pregnancy, as far as management interventions, there's certainly many important ones to consider here, because that's when fetal growth and development are really happening in a quantitative and qualitative sense. Colostrum supply is really being established by nutrition in that last couple weeks of pregnancy, and mammary development as well is influenced by nutrition during this phase, and is an important aspect of management. We focus on pre-breeding flushing nutrition. So flushing, as most of you would agree, is that period of time where you improve the diet of a ewe prior to mating mostly. And the concept here is that the sheep's brain responds to signals indicating that the ewe is well fed. Therefore, she increases her ovulation rate, or the number of viable eggs produced. Here in most simple terms, and this is kind of a little bit of an exaggeration here, but we see the pulsatility of luteinizing hormone, which is produced by neurons, or excuse me, it's produced in the anterior pituitary, and it has a pulsatile secretion. And when in a simple model, which I won't describe too much here, if we really severely fast animals, we definitely can impact that axis, and which ultimately will reduce ovulation rate in simple terms. So some of the factors to consider in flushing would be both short and long-term nutrition. By short-term nutrition, I'll talk about just that immediate energy status of the animal, and long-term might relate more to her body condition or body fatness. Okay. So increasing this plane of nutrition, mostly energy nutrition, is the primary. For even as little as just a few days can improve ovulation rate in underfed ewes. And some people have done some experimental work showing that even in improving increasing even glucose levels in a ewe, which would be an energy and currency in the body, by infusing glucose just for a short period of time can also cause spikes and improve LH pulsatility. So it's pretty responsive to energy status. And ewes that are gaining weight, or positive energy balance, we'll call it here, are going to ovulate at higher rates. And as I mentioned, body condition is important, especially in the sense that both fat ewes, they're not going to respond actually very well, but sheep in that middle range are more optimal for responses, and they're certainly going to respond better than thin ewes, we'll say. They ovulate at higher rates than thin ewes. They don't necessarily, thin ewes will respond to improved nutrition more than fat ewes, but being fat is actually a little bit better than being thin per se too. So there's both the short and long-term aspect of nutrition that has to be considered in flushing. Some of the responses that you might expect would be up to 25% would be a kind of a typical flushing response. In the studies that we've done, we see responses probably 30% over not flushing or just feeding like a maintenance diet. Typical diet you might feed to a dry ewe. If you increase their nutrition, you can get a pretty big response. Even in thin ewes, people have seen greater responses, up to 57%, in fact, in experimental situations with controls. But this flushing response can be lost if sheep are not managed properly in early pregnancy. For example, if they lose a lot of weight, a lot of that improvement in embryonic embryo numbers, I guess, or fetal numbers can be lost quickly if the animal isn't properly fed in early pregnancy. Interestingly, at least in the literature, overfeeding in early pregnancy may also depress rate of embryos that implant. It's supposed to be an implant there. I missed the C or E, sorry. At maintenance level, nutrition is needed during early pregnancy, or gains may be lost, as I said. Okay, so what kind of targets would we consider for this? What we found is that if we have a 50 to 100% increase in energy intake, we've had better responses in our sheep production systems with doubling their energy supply. So it's a 100% increase. So we're increasing them double maintenance. We've seen pretty nice effects for about a 2 to 3 week period. Generally, this would be an increase of about half of a body condition score, or maybe slightly more. Sort of 7 to 10 pounds of body weight. So the key here is to put the sheep in a positive weight gain. And you might increase or decrease the length of this flushing program a bit based on their condition score. Thin ewes, perhaps you start it earlier, for example. You don't have to do this with concentrates purely, although achieving a double maintenance feeding is a little bit hard without some energy supplementation. But we can get close to that with some grazing programs with the right type of grazing management and forage quality. And of course, you can do it precisely if you are doing a feeding system with energy supplements such as corn and barley and so forth, combined with some good quality forage. Again, embryo retention and mentation might be reduced if we keep this going well into the breeding, well past conception, however. So we are now suggesting to maybe stop this about the time we turn rams in, which is actually pretty convenient, or just maybe shortly thereafter. Here's just an example of some used grazing, some annual forages we planted. We're flushing them on these forages. In certain systems, this might be a good option, depending on the resource space of the farm. This is just an example of something I've done on my own personal farm for flushing in late August, when typically I'm not going to have my perennial pastures are necessarily going to be limiting. So these annual forages fill a nice hole there. So I thought I'd show you some examples of some studies, a study that we pursued looking at these questions. And what we did is we altered the energy intake during the 3 week period in our production system. Our production system we've been working on at Michigan State is called accelerated production, and we do an 8-month program. And so the ewes are exposed to rams every 8 months. Essentially, they're weaned, their lambs are weaned, and then they get a 3 week dry period, if you want to call it that, to recover, and then we turn rams in. So during this 21-day period, we have tried to optimize the nutritional management by feeding ewes differently. And so again, it's a 5-month accelerated system. So what we did is we imposed 3 treatments where we fed them either 50, 100, or 200% as it worked out of their maintenance energy requirements. So this was done by limit feeding them, total mixed ration, we call our base TMR. This is the energy caloric intake or megacal intake in ME that they achieved. We did doubling of that for our kind of middle diet, and then our high diet was we just gave them unlimited access to our enriched TMR with a little more corn in it. And this ended up, as it just turned out, really doubling their energy intake. So it worked out pretty nicely. We had 50% of their maintenance energy requirements, 100%. So they didn't really gain or lose weight on that diet. And then we doubled their maintenance energy requirements. We did this, that wasn't a huge set of sheep. There are about 33 animals per treatment, but we did it both in the spring and in the fall. So we did it with the same set of sheep, essentially the same set of sheep in the spring, and then at their next opportunity to mate, which would be late fall, early winter. So in the spring, this would be, we call it like our suboptimal photo period. We don't want to call it out of season because these sheep do still cycle in response to rams, but they certainly are less active. And then in early winter, that might be a little past the peak of breeding, but certainly within what we call like our more normal or optimal breeding season. So the mating procedure that we use teaser rams to help make sure that we have our ewes induced And these were added about 14 days before fertile ram turn-in. So it was about 7 days after the beginning of our treatment period. So the last 14 days of that 21 days, there were teaser rams in there. We had a pretty strong, I guess you would call it concentrated ram coverage. Our rams were in there at about 1 to 20 to 1 to 25 ewes. And just to make sure we didn't have an effective ram, in the sense for this experiment, we rotated our rams every 24 hours. Other experiments we've done at 12 hours. And then we had a mating period of roughly 2 heat cycles or 34 days. So here's what we found. These relatively underfed ewes, and we have spring mating here on top, okay? Let's see if I can get a pointer for you. Use a laser pointer. Okay, we have spring mating here, early winter mating here, I'll call it. The ewes lost considerable amount of weight when they're underfed, whether spring or early winter. The control ewes actually did lose a little bit of weight, which wasn't really by design. Some of that could have been gut fill. It wasn't a lot of weight, and these are in pounds. Some of it might be due to the fact that these ewes are still operating at a higher metabolism because they were just weaning the lambs off of them than true maintenance metabolism. But nonetheless, it wasn't a big change. And then the 200% group gained a considerable amount of weight, as you would imagine. What we saw is a big boost in litter size. So this was done by ultrasound, and it really held up. Our lambing rates were very similar. We had very little loss of lambs. So we had a big boost between 100 and 200. Really, underfeeding didn't have an impact. Same thing, exact same situation was present for early winter, where we saw this big boost in lambing rate. Note that, of course, in spring mating, we have lower, in fall lambing, we have lower litter sizes than in early winter. But you can see flushing, the flushing effect was pretty strong for both, and pretty much the same relative percent increase or magnitude increase in both spring and early winter. So that's a pretty significant impact. If you were to assign a dollar value to the cost of that, you'd find a really favorable rate of return on your investment. So flushing and maintenance has had a huge impact on lambing percentage. We had about a 30-40% increase. Actually, it was a little more than I said. Maintenance feeding, I'll say it negatively here, it's as bad as underfeeding, which is the case here. I mean, we didn't really see a difference. Look at it that way. And yeah, we were able to achieve high conception rates, and this was purely with natural mating. Natural mating in the sense there were no light protocols or hormones applied to these sheep. We did use teaser rams, if you call it, that's still, I would view that as a natural mating methodology, but it isn't quite, standard mating to all people. But that's a caveat to remember. And yeah, and flushing has a large return on investment. We've calculated that, and it's big in our systems. Another thing to remember that, and I'm not showing you this data, we did a more recent study, I know Whit's aware of. We found that in that case, we didn't see quite the same flushing responses, but these, in that particular study, the ewes were fed throughout the whole mating season. Excuse me. And we found little response in our flushing diets then. There were a few differences. We didn't feed quite to the same level as 200% as we did in this study, but we extended them all throughout the breeding season. And there is some evidence, pretty strong evidence in literature that overfeeding, like at the level that we were, might have some impact on implantation, a negative impact. So that's why we're kind of backing off our suggestion to continue to feed these sheep through early pregnancy. It's something I'm a little tentative in saying a whole lot about that because we need to study it more. Excuse me, I have a little scratch in my throat here. So what are we still trying to answer? That would be, what is the optimum flushing nutrition program? The timing, should it be 1 week? Should it be 4 weeks? How short can it be and be beneficial? Because that would be nice to know. If it was worth someone doing it for a week, is it worth doing it for a week? If it was, it'd be awesome to know, right? That would have some economic impact on sheep production. How long do you really need from the previous lactation, for example? What degree? We think it's probably in this range based on what we're learning. And is there a particular weight gain or body condition score target we're trying to achieve? I think we're still working that out, I would argue. And, you know, when should we cease energy supplementation? I kind of alluded to the fact that maybe stopping at the beginning of mating or shortly after ram turn in might be important. We don't know precisely that story yet. Okay. So that's the part that I wanted to present on flushing. So next thing I want to talk about is Ulam development programs. And I've been pretty interested in the subject area, both as a sheep producer and as extension specialist. You know, first of all, is breeding Ulams a good or bad idea? And that's going to depend on a number of factors I'll discuss here, but just kind of laying out what is known in that area. I'm going to talk about factors that determine the age of puberty in sheep, and then bring that together, hopefully, with explaining some development guidelines that you might want to consider for your replacement females. So here's just a study from quite a long time ago, late 60s, done at the Sheep Experiment Station, Du Bois, I believe. And what they did here was they looked at 3 different breeds, 3 conventional breeds of the day, Rambouillet, Targhee, and Columbia. And what they did is they examined these sheep according to whether they had lambs in their first year of life or not. And what they show you here is the cumulative of performance. And this is the cumulative performance as their number of lambs born and number of lambs weaned, not including that first year of life. So if they gave birth as ewe lambs, that's not included here. So this is just their performance over the next 5 lambings, which would be years 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. And what was consistent with this work, and this has been repeated in other sheep and other parts of the world as well, that they see a consistent improvement in lifetime productivity or long-term productivity of ewes that were able to conceive as ewe lambs. Okay. So you can see whether it's a Rambouillet, a Targhee, or a Columbia. In each case, we look at the average here, we see a significant effect. We see a difference between number of lambs and total pounds, these ewes are more productive, 9% greater lifetime productivity if they could breed at 12 months of age. Now, does this hold up for more productive, prolific breeds? I would say I'm pretty confident it would. I'm not sure we have quite as much data on that. So why would this be? You know, if you think about it, probably a lot of factors at play. I'm not sure we know exactly which of these dominate, but it could be a mothering influence. You know, mothering experience as ewe lambs might have some beneficial impact later. I would say that's probably not a huge factor. Perhaps more likely, it could be genes that control early puberty are going to be linked to those that control ovulation rate. I think that's I'm a little more confident that could be a reasonable explanation. And then maybe it's broader than that. Maybe these genes that are controlling early puberty are linked to those that control other aspects of productivity beyond ovulation rate, perhaps mothering, milk production, embryo survival. Maybe there's a whole host of traits that are affected by these genes that kind of create an additive effect that we see with greater productivity. Okay. There's a lot of things to consider when you want to breed ewe lambs. I mean, it isn't a complete slam dunk for everybody. Because even though I'm explaining this is perhaps a good selection tool minimally to find your more productive sheep, you need to understand consider if you have the feed inventory to do this properly. And what is the return in terms of productivity? You're going to have about a 30% increase in feed cost if breeding these ewe lambs for their first year of life. So that's an increase. And their productivity is not going to be that much greater than that. Maybe you're going to get increase in lamb production just a bit. So they aren't a huge improvement in lamb production. But you need to consider, are these non-productive ewe lambs really a dead asset in your farming portfolio? There's overhead and maintenance costs associated with them with really no return. So they're not really doing much. But is there extra labor involved if you were to lamb these ewe lambs? And is it worth it? Okay. And then another, I think, important one is, what is the salvage value of non-fertile ewe lambs compared to non-fertile 2-year-olds? I think we'd agree that salvage value of non-fertile ewe lambs is high because they're essentially a slaughter lamb with high lamb prices. Non-fertile ewe lamb's going to be not nearly the same opportunity. So you lose an opportunity there. So you know that some sheep are going to be infertile for whatever reason. Is it better to find that out when they're ewe lambs or 2-year-olds? So generation interval, breeding ewe lambs is going to reduce it, obviously, and that's an advantage for seed stock producers. So that would be something to consider as well. So just to summarize this question, I'd say selecting ewe lambs based on their ability to lamb as lambs is certainly going to favor greater lifetime productivity. And salvage value of ewe lambs is high, especially if you detect them early. And you can do that with ultrasound. So if you have access to ultrasound technology, that's a pretty convenient and reliable means of doing that. That's what a lot of producers in my region will do. They'll definitely scan the ewe lambs and sell them as high value slaughter lambs, the ones that don't conceive. And that has a selection tool, that serves a selection tool for the flock as well by improving lifetime productivity, hopefully. But you need to understand, and I'll talk about this next a bit, that these ewe lambs are going to require some management that's sort of outside of what you might normally consider in terms of feeding, both birth management and perhaps separating them as a group during these different stages of production. And yeah, don't set your expectations terribly high because they're going to pay for their feed, but not much more. And I'd say that breeding ewe lambs is going to be less of a question for people who are interested in accelerated production, working with the kind of breeds that you would in these kinds of systems, or perhaps with seed stock producers that are focused on genetic gain because you get more information quicker that way. So we think about the factors that regulate the onset of puberty. They're, I'll distill them into 3 simple categories here if you want. We have new season, reproduction. So season would be photo period, or nutrition, and genetics. So puberty basically occurs when we get this increased pulsatility of the GnRH LH axis here, and we get more frequent pulses. And what turns on those pulses is a number of different factors that I'll talk about next. Some are related to nutrition and some are intrinsic to other genes that we maybe don't have fully identified yet. But there's certainly environmental cues that do influence this, is what we're going to talk about. So here's just some field work I did where we looked at lambs born in 3 different lambing periods in our accelerated systems. We have lambs born in October, February, and May. And we looked at the age at which they would, half of them tend to reach puberty. And we find with lambs born in October, and this kind of shows you the kind of optimal photo periods here if you want, shown in kind of this orange color. So we have fall, then we have this anestrus period that sheep have, and then we have another more optimal photo period for reproduction. So we find that these lambs born in October, they really don't get exposed to that optimal photo period until much later. And so they tend to have a delayed onset of puberty. Lambs born midwinter, similarly, they don't have maybe the optimal photo period until they're a little bit older, whereas lambs born in late spring will reach puberty much more quickly on average. So season of birth makes a pretty big impact on attainment of puberty. So light is an important consideration in this equation. So nutrition is well known to have an influence on attainment of puberty, pretty much in all species, mammalian species. while back, I did some work looking at lambs born either faster or more slowly on a grain-based versus a forage-based diet. And we looked at the attainment of puberty in these set of ewe lambs. We had about 16 in a group. And we found by 7 months of age that the fast-growing lambs definitely reached puberty more quickly than the slow-growing lambs. And when we did body composition analysis on these lambs by essentially grinding their carcasses and doing a full chemical composition, we found that the body fatness to reach puberty, we estimated around 28%. So we found that, yeah, in that slow growing group, there's a certain percentage that did attain puberty, and they tended to be higher, more fat than those that didn't. So that was pretty clear in this work. So, and then the fast growing lambs were fatter all told. So there was some variation in slow growing lambs, and it was the fatter of the slow growing lambs that did attain puberty. So we kind of surmised that they probably need to be about this percent fat, which actually is pretty similar to what we see when lambs tend to achieve around 70% of their mature size, or kind of the size of maybe an optimal finishing weight for a lamb depending on their genetic size. So what determines body fatness? Well, certainly, as I just said, mature size. So animals, as they mature, their body composition naturally changes and they lay down fat, as you would know. And so using percent of mature size is a pretty reasonable thing to do to estimate body fatness in animals. Diet also impacts that attainment versus whether they're growing fast or slow. If you grow animals at a faster rate, they're going to deposit fat at a higher rate as well, because they have this sort of excess energy that they can partition into fat deposition. So here's some a bunch of different studies that Paul Kenyon put together in New Zealand when he studied this pretty carefully in their sheep farming systems. And he found that if you look at maturity, which would be a pretty good proxy for fatness, they found that their fertility of these ewe lambs exposed to lambs, so these would have been exposed when they're, I think, around 8 months of age in their system. They usually have ewe lambs lamb about a month later than mature ewes in New Zealand. What he found is that here he established these relationships where if you breed ewe lambs around 70% of mature size, you're going to have a pretty high conception rate. 60 is going to be lower, and breeding them at these lower percent of mature sizes really drops off quite fast. This is just simply a study I did many years ago now, looking at, we did this for a different purpose, but it shows a relationship between body fatness and rate of growth. And these were a bunch of lambs that we killed, relatively young lambs, we killed at different endpoints, and we did chemical composition on their carcass. And we found that those that were grown slowly always had a relatively lower body fatness at the same end body weight compared to those that were grown more quickly. And this would hold up pretty much in many studies. I just happen to have some of my own data to show here to show that that relationship holds. So if they're grown more slowly to the same body endpoint, they're always relatively more lean. So it isn't just mature size, but mature size is a pretty good indicator, as you can see, as they become larger percent of mature size, they go up, but there's also an influence of energy diet at the time. So genetics are a big factor too. I just summarized some different breeds here according to, and some examples of these breeds. I've kind of made categories, and they go from early puberty to late puberty. So these prolific short-tailed breeds from Northern Europe, like the Finn and Romanoff, they're going to be very, very early, whereas some of our more later maturing animals would be some of our long wool breeds from the UK, like the Lincoln, Romney, and Leicester. Crossbreeding also influences puberty. If you were to examine it, you would find that usually the crossbred lambs reach puberty earlier than their parent breed, just kind of the definition of hybrid vigor. So you get an advantage there. Um, so, you know, as far as guidelines for developing ewe lambs is concerned, season of birth, genetics, and rate of growth are key factors. Ewe lambs born during the late spring are going to have the least seasonal barrier to reach puberty and reach puberty faster if everything else is the same. And that's what we find time and time again. You do need to remove the ram lambs from the ewe lambs when those late spring-born lambs more quickly than you would other groups, or they will breed their siblings basically from the same lamb crop. Establishing a % threshold of mature maternal body weight is going to provide a pretty good target, but it might require some adjustment according to season. So if you establish 70% as kind of your mature weight target, that might work great for example, for Mayborn lambs. But if you want to get the same percentage to breed that are born in winter, you might want to call a 75% mature size as a better target. And you might adjust that mature size based on breed too. So if you're dealing with Finn sheep, you could have maybe 65% mature size because they're genetically more reach puberty earlier. Whereas if it's maybe like a Suffolk, which are more intermediate, maybe you want them 75. So those are some factors to consider in all of this. Some other considerations are these. With our systems, we have an opportunity sometimes to breed lambs. Since in our accelerated systems, we expose sheep every 4 months. So we often have an opportunity to breed them at 7 months versus 11 months of age. And so instead of lambing at 12 months of age, we could push them to lamb 4 months later. And that might be wise, especially for some of these fall and winter born lambs. What we found is where we're thinking, I don't know if we've really found this, I'd be careful how I say that ewes that achieve greater reproductive maturity for mating might exhibit more estrus cycles, and that stands to reason. What we found in some of our breeds is we tend to have, I just coined this phrase, other people have as well. We call it early dilation syndrome. So we see that in early season lambs. What happens is essentially these lambs, they don't dilate fully when they get close to term, and they sometimes dilate a little prematurely even. So sort of in the late 130-day phase, their cervix opens up a tiny bit, and basically, they're unable to deliver a lamb. And that's pretty catastrophic because generally the ewe or the lamb and or both will perish in that case. But we found that this condition, and we think it's due to a relative immaturity of this parturition cascade. Now, we can't really prove that's just our theory, but it really disappears if we just take these lambs and ask them and mate them 4 months later instead, where they're a little older. We don't see this in our Mayborn lambs because our theory is that they have had relatively more heat cycles before their first mating. So we think that lambing at 16 months might be important in certain conditions if you have that opportunity, like in production systems that we work with. Okay, so you can also lower the mature size, but if you breed your ewe lambs at, that's fine. That might be a reasonable selection tool for you to have, but you need to recognize that you're not going to get the same conception rate. And maybe that's what you'd like to do to select more rigidly for this trait, but recognize you got to adjust your expectations. We looked at 3 years of data of lambs, of ewes lambing at 12 months of age versus 16 months of age. And what we found is, and these are lambs that are relatively more mature, the 16-month-old lambs, these are all the same breed and the same flock. And they're at about 80% of their mature size versus slightly less than 70. We had a higher conception rate in these ewe lambs, definitely get a higher ovulation rate. We get if we look at our weaning weight, they tend to be even a little better too. And then the pounds of lamb born per ewe exposed is quite different. And so maybe this extra 4 months of rearing, if you're in a production system that allows for it, like we have in some of ours, might be worth it because you get quite a bit greater productivity. So that's another consideration. As far as breeding management of ewe lambs goes, recognize that estrus cues in these ewe lambs are pretty subtle. They don't really compete well for attention of rams with mature ewes. Their heat period is shorter. It's been documented. And, in mature ewes, it's close to 30 hours, and ewe lambs, it's generally less than 24. Teaser rams are relatively more useful in breeding ewe lambs. So use them if you have them. That's a pretty good system. Mature ram coverage needs to be higher in ewe lambs to have optimal results. And if you use ram lambs instead of mature rams, you should increase this coverage even greater. So when I list a percentage here, 5% would be, for example, 1 ram to every 20 ewes. That'd be 5% coverage. 3% coverage would be 1 ram to every 33 ewes. As far as management during pregnancy goes, I would recommend scanning them to remove the open ewe lambs. It's also useful if you have the opportunity to scan for litter size, especially in ewe lambs, because their management, since they're all still growing, meeting their requirements becomes important, and there's pretty important differences in a single versus twin ewe lambs and rearing ewe lamb, bearing ewe lamb, one that's carrying singles versus twins as opposed to maybe mature sheep. So we feed for growth during the first 2/3 of pregnancy, the same as we normally would. And then for late pregnancy, we feed them according to litter size. And then ewe lambs need to gain about 44 pounds during pregnancy in most breeds. And 22 of that might be true growth, and the rest would be that of the pregnant uterus. So here's a picture of scanning some sheep. Lactation management, best if they're managed as a separate group. They're just not as competitive in a feeding system as mature ewes are. And we'd like to target so they're not losing weight during lactation. And we found that it is possible to do that when we feed them properly. And that's a good guideline to shoot for. And then just other like peripheral things that are very important, especially in a pasture-based system where you've got parasite infectivity potential. You're going to have to manage these ewe lambs more aggressively for parasites because they're really much more susceptible than older ewes, and the state of lactation makes them even more so. And it's really not a good group, perhaps, to undertreat, whereas in a whole farm management program, you might be more selective on older ewes. Ewe lambs is probably a poor idea. So to summarize all of this, ewe lambs are able to conceive as lambs have greater productivity, and it can be a good selection tool. Body condition fatness is going to be a pretty big determinant of whether they can reach puberty or not. That's well known. And so it's related to mature size, making mature size a pretty good predictor. Prolific breeds are going to definitely reach puberty earlier. That's obviously, that's very clear. Season of birth and mating have a large impact on reproduction. So if you need to consider that in some reproduction systems. And then I would suggest that managing them in grouping strategies during breeding, most certainly to get a high conception rate. And then also I would say during pregnancy and lactation are important to get, your best outcomes. So that's pretty much what I have to talk about today here. If you have questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, I'd be happy to discuss and talk and further this conversation. And furthermore, if you're shy and you don't want to ask now, I can be contacted by email pretty easily. And here's my contact information.
I'm just chomping at the bit to ask a question. So,
Uh-oh. That's good.
Richard,
Yeah.
the dilation syndrome you were talking about, what
Yes.
percentage of a cohort do you usually observe that percentage-wise?
Yeah. It can be 10%. I would give a 10% as a
Wow.
round number. Yeah. So it's significant, and it's yeah. And we've looked at it in we're still learning about it. So I just kind of asking, you guys ever run into this condition in Ulams?
Richard, in my experience, the calls I get, it is, yeah, I don't have a good percentage. That's why it's just really interesting to me to hear that
Okay.
that
Yeah.
16-month threshold can reduce it.
Yeah. So I don't know if I made it perfectly clear, but we see very few cases in Mayborn lambs lambing at 12 months of age. You can see a few, but like it might be 1 or 2%. But if you take winter-born ewe lambs or fall-born ewe lambs don't generally lamb at 12 months of age very easily, but the winter-born ewe lambs are the biggest problem. So in the middle of winter, if you have ewes lamb at 12 months of age, we see that 10% rate come into play unfortunately pretty commonly. So we've just, and that's pretty devastating to production. So we've been backing off on some of that, and these are some we're talking, dozens of farms have seen this. So it isn't really related to specific farms so much. And we think, so we're starting to see more of a general picture with it.
Any mastitis issues on the ewes fed the 200% ration after weaning?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. No, in fact, we don't to really look at that carefully. You need some pretty big numbers. So I don't want to be like too offhand and say no, but we didn't in this case, and we don't in general on those flushing diets. But we do, and I didn't describe this, a dry op diet. It takes about 7 days. So we started about 4 days before we pull lambs, and we have the sheep on it for about 2 or 3 days after. But we ramp them up to a high energy diet within 5 or 6 days post weaning. So we pretty much shut down milk by removing protein and reducing energy for about 5 or 6 days. And then we get them on this pretty quickly. So I didn't add that part. So as long as you do that, you should be fine. In fact, anecdotally, we did see more cases of mastitis in the underfed ewes than the overfed ewes. I'm not sure that they would add up statistically to be different, but we definitely numerically saw more cases. So I think that the underfeeding can be done to too great of an extent where you actually hamper the ewes' immunity essentially for protection against mastitis. So, but yeah.
Okay. When do you stop the energy supplementation after flushing?
In the study that I showed you, it was done right at ram turn-in, which was kind of convenient. And so I guess I would say we saw good results with that protocol. We did use teaser rams. So these ewes bred, like, I don't know exactly the percent, but I'd say 90% bred in that first cycle. And moreover, probably 75% of, the majority of those ewes cycled that or bred like 5 or 6 days after ram turn-in. So in that range, so they were bred pretty quickly after we turned off the energy. And yeah, so that's what I can tell you.
Okay, and then there was a question on when did you wean the lambs in that study?
Oh, when did we wean lambs? Okay, so walking backwards, like when do we typically wean lambs in our system? So our lambs are weaned an average of approximately 60 days of age. So they're kind of in that, they're not really early weaned in some regards, but so 60 days of age. So that'd be like day 60 of lactation, and then they're bred 3 weeks later.
Okay. It looks like one more at this point. This question says, I lamb spring and fall. I run the ewes as a single group. Can I feed the ewes I'm flushing identical to the pregnant ewes pre-lambing? I worry about the pregnant ewes getting too fat. I use cedars, so all the sheep are mostly the same stages.
Okay, so I guess the question was, I'm not quite sure how those groups align with their nutrient requirements. I can't quite maybe see that here. So if you have half of them lambing in the spring and half of them lambing in the fall, the question is, can I give like a flushing diet to a ewe that's maybe whatever, I'm not stating. The flushing diet, that 200% of maintenance is about what you should feed twin pregnant ewes the last 30 days of pregnancy, if that helps. That's actually very close. So that's actually a very good diet for late pregnancy. Yeah, it would be way too much to give and wasteful to give to sheep at a different stage of production, and might be of some harm, because you don't want obese sheep entering late pregnancy, because then they tend to get metabolic disturbances like ketosis, right? But it's compatible with the late pregnancy nutrition. So hopefully that answers the question a bit.
Yeah. Okay. This question is, would you expect to see differences in the periparturient rise in egg count and worm load in ewes at different feeding levels?
I haven't done research in that area. I'm guessing that others have, so I'm not going to be able to answer that. It's a good question. I do think my guess is I'll say yes, I think, but I don't know how dramatic it is. You generally don't see, well, okay, I can tell you this. You mean the periparturient, around parturition, okay. You don't see much of a rise until they give birth, because we've looked at this a few times. I do see a greater rise in ewes raising triplets. So it is related to perhaps nutritional status. So our ewes rearing triplets you're never going to quite meet, this is kind of a roundabout answer, but you're never going to quite meet their nutrient requirements nearly as well, right, as those raising singles. So I'd say yes, it does have an impact. I think the bigger impact is that early lactation energy intake would seem to me maybe a little more important in late pregnancy, but we do see some rise in periparturient egg count. So we actually have used some of that knowledge to do a selective deworming program at lambing. So we found that if we treat the ewes that are raising triplets, or those that are in poorer body condition rearing twins, just those groups, we get pretty good control of parasitic larvae numbers during lactation. And we've used that as kind of a treatment protocol. So we kind of leave the singles that are well fed, we don't treat those. That's kind of a refugia management group, and maybe our good, well doing twins, but just right in the lambing jug, treating the triplets and the skinnier twins has worked pretty well. And when we followed fecal egg counts, we do see a rise in those that we don't treat, but they never become kind of clinical, and the growth of the lambs has never been impacted. Whereas the ones that we did treat, they certainly, they had a faster rise in that late pregnancy period before we treated. We did see that. So that kind of gave me a clue that they were going to rise even more during lactation. And then, but they were essentially had no infection. So I think we controlled infection well in the sheep that were at greatest risk. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think it is related to plain nutrition and certainly energy status. I know that.
Yep, I agree with that. So one more question. For lambs weaned earlier, say at 42 to 50 days, would you guess the post-weaning rations that you listed would give similar results and fewer mastitis issues at the 200% ration?
Can you repeat that? I'm not quite.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so for lambs weaned earlier
Okay.
at 42 to 50 days.
Earlier than like I'm suggesting. Okay.
I'm going to say yes, but if that's not the case, Randall, put that in the chat. So lambs weaned 42 to 50 days earlier, would you guess the post-weaning rations list that you gave would give similar results and few mastitis issues at the 200% ration?
I gotcha. I understand. So like, yeah, so it is a question of like, if we wean them a bit earlier, would we see potential mastitis? I would say those ewes are milking like gangbusters still at day 60. So, and we know that because we've looked at milk production in these sheep, and they are not declining in milk production, especially in our well-fed sheep. So I don't think you would see, by reason then, I don't think there would be much of a difference in mastitis. So I'd feel pretty comfortable saying yes, that those diets would work, with a caveat that you would put it in a dry off program, which might have been good if I showed you that, but that dry off program is pretty important in any sheep production system. But I would suggest that the dry off programs are often recommended, or don't need to be weeks on end and don't need to be as severe perhaps as what's been recommended in the past. We can shut down milk production without influencing body condition so much with a more subtle program.
Okay. Randall says thanks, so sounds like you hit it.
All right.
Jean says, you said that milk production is still strong at 60 days. At what days do you think the milk quality declines significantly?
Milk quality or like quantity, maybe? Not sure, but so peak lactation in most meat breeds of sheep is going to be around day 30. But kind of I know I have this published, but like what we found in the meat sheep we've studied, if we feed them these high diets, they continue to milk really well later up until like day 60, like I said. So we don't see that. We see the persistency of lactation continue. The underfed sheep do drop off, I think, more. And as far as their composition goes, it's generally milk composition, like fat, protein, and so forth, are generally a little richer actually in late lactation. The volume's going down, so the quality, if that's what you're asking, is still all there late lactation. Usually the quantity is less, but day 60 isn't really late lactation for sheep quite yet. But you know, our sheep seem to have good persistency, at least through day 60. I would imagine if we pushed them to day 80, which wouldn't make sense for our system at all because we're trying to get them rebred, we'd see some drop off. I'm sure we would because they're not dairy sheep genetics. But interestingly, we didn't see that, especially in our well-fed sheep.
I think we have exhausted all the questions. And thanks so much for coming on. This has been great. And I know you have some other topics that I'm going to hit you up for here in the future. So let's see. Next week is the University of Idaho Rangeland Center Fall Forum. We're going to skip our traditional webinar next week to let you guys have the opportunity to join in on that. It's free and it's available online just like these are. So make sure you check that out, especially if you're doing any sort of range grazing. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you for sharing all this great information with us.
Well, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. Yep.
All right, we'll catch up with you soon.